Snow drifted sideways, though every flake carried the taste of burnt stone. It caught on the torn scales of roof tiles, lodged in the black curls of dead ivy, skimmed the spiderwork of broken beams, and vanished in steam above the smoldering guts of King's Landing. Jon picked his way through streets that had once been lanes but were now seams in a fused ashfield, a map whose name had been forgotten. He could not tell the living from the dead by their color. Only the sound gave difference. The living moaned or whispered. The dead said nothing. The wind, pushing east from the Blackwater, moved char and heat, but it did not move the grief in his chest. A horse limped past him without a rider and without a head. He kept walking because there was nowhere else to go. Ahead, the hill climbed like a fist of rock, and above it a silhouette that had haunted him since boyhood. The palace of the kings of men, those foolish, cruel men, those brave, doomed men. He had been told that his blood once ruled this city, that a dragon laid its foundations in fire and forged its thrones in fear. He had been taught to be ashamed of that blood and then asked to claim it. He could not find a word for that teaching, so he said nothing and climbed. He passed an alley where women cowered around a brazier made of a kettle that had melted and reflowered. One of them looked up with eyes ringed black with soot. The child slumped against her breast was too still to be sleeping. Jon bowed his head and moved on, because bending to one grief was a betrayal of 10 others, and if he stopped he would never move again. Somewhere to the south, he heard unsullied barking orders in a rasping foreign cadence. To the west, steel cracked bone. It was all of a piece. The arch leading to the keep had fallen. He ducked under, brushed ash from the pommel of Longclaw, and crossed the courtyard. The sigil banners were gone, their poles broken and burned. He had no memory of the last time he had stood here with hope. That too felt burned. At the top of the stairs a man waited for him, spare and hollow-eyed, his fine clothes hanging as if even they had lost faith in his bones. "Don't keep your queen waiting," Tyrion Lannister said. The words had the shape of something he had once said lightly. Now they were a stone. His voice, always a quick blade, moved slowly, as if cutting a knot he could not see. "The world is changed already, Jon, but it may still change again. When you go to her." Jon searched Tyrion's face for the jest that had always been there and found only a tired ruin that looked like a face approaching winter. "I know," he said, and heard the lie inside his own voice as if it were a pebble rattling in a jar. He knew nothing. He had not known the bells would fail. He had not known the dragon would dance. He had not known his heart would go so still when fire took the first 1,000 lives. "She won," Tyrion said. He gestured toward the ragged horizon. "This is what winning looks like. She will say she has a new world to build." His eyes shifted to Jon's sword hilt, the wolf head scarred and ash-grimed. "I think she means to build it out of bones." Jon did not answer. He set his jaw and passed Tyrion, and the dwarf did not stop him again. Inside the long hall, the height of it surprised him. Past kings had not been shy about reminding men of their smallness. Ash drifted from holes punched in the roof by claws or fire. A wind moved in currents that smelled of turned earth, wet iron, old smoke. Columns were cracked. The great doors to the inner chamber hung at strange angles. He walked the last yards alone, though he was never alone now. Ghosts kept pace with him, quiet, stubborn, familiar as his own shadow. She was at the far end in a cascade of light coming through a torn aperture where a wall had been. Behind her, beyond the broken teeth of stone, the city sprawled wet and dark and steaming, a field of scattered lanterns. Her hair, ash blonde, tangled at her shoulders. Her breast rose and fell with breath like someone who had run a great distance and was only now stopping to look behind. The thing at her side turned its scaled head and watched Jon through a coal-bright eye, smoke frilling from its nostrils. The dragon's hide was a welter of ash and old scars, an island of living darkness. Daenerys Targaryen took a step forward. The hall shivered as if remembering the footfalls of other conquerors. "You came," she said. Her voice was calm. He had forgotten that she could sound like water when she wished. "I came," Jon said. The words were difficult because everything in his throat felt thick with the dust of 1,000 collapsed roofs. He stopped a measured distance from her because once he had learned the measure of danger and affection, and he kept to that measure though it had failed him again and again. He looked into her face and searched for what he had loved, and he found it, but not alone. Other things were there. He did not know their names. "I did what I must," she said quietly. She was speaking to a court that had burned. "You saw what they did long before me to my family, to the children in this city, for centuries. What they do to each other when they are permitted to rule themselves. I will not permit it." He thought of the girl and the dead child. He thought of his father, who had lived like a stone with eyes. He thought of the words that boy had said before he fell in the dark. For the watch. He thought of the fire, and the bells, and the sky shedding ash like starless snow. "We can build without burning," he said. Her mouth softened, then hardened. "Not this time, not this city. This rot is in the bones. I will make something new where this deadness stands. And then more. And when they try to stop me, I will stop them first. We will free everyone." We, he thought, and the wind inside him rose, and on its crest he saw faces. Sansa's face, pale as a winter dawn. Bran's face, blind and seeing. Arya's face, quick and bright as a knife. Sam's kind, worried eyes. Tormund's laugh. And his father's face, quiet, holding too much. "I am not your enemy," he said, and felt the precariousness of that truth. "I have never been your enemy." She stepped closer. The dragon's breath moved smoke in a ring, wariness, but not yet fire. "You are mine," she said, "by blood, by what we are." She lifted a hand. It trembled. Ash clung to her wrist like powdered bone. He took her hand and kissed it, and her breath caught, and he felt the foolish sweetness of something that had nearly been. "Aegon," she whispered. The name fit his mouth like a coin he had kept under his tongue for fear that others would take it. He had never owned it. Now, in that broken hall, it came forward like a ghost into the light. "Aegon," he repeated. "I am Jon. I am both." She smiled. It was not mad, that smile. It was radiant as a blade's first gleam. "Then stand with me, Aegon. Stand with your queen. We will break chains across the world." He knew suddenly and with the bluntness of a hammer how love could be a chain, and he could not breathe. He felt again the soft fold of wings across a black sky and heard men screaming, and he felt his own heart lay itself down and refuse to beat. He stepped into her and gathered her as if he was boarding a ship he would never return from. Her hair smelled of smoke and salt like a burned shore. He felt her smile against his cheek. His arms tightened. She was so light it frightened him. "We will make it right," he said into her hair, and his voice trembled, and she nodded against him, trusting. He kissed her. It was sweet. It lasted long enough to remember, not long enough to undo anything. He let the kiss be the burial of what they had almost been. When she sighed, it trembled like a bird. He felt the emptiness open inside him like winter over a field. His hand found the place where the knife would go because his father had taught him mercy, and mercy, he knew, had edges. The breath left her like a candle. Her eyes widened, full of water and gold, and then they were only eyes. He held her to him as her knees weakened and the light shifted and the dragon made a sound that was not a roar or a cry but something older. He held her until her weight passed into the stones. Then the dragon moved. Drogon's face came near with heat that turned the dust to mist. Jon stood looking into that ancient, impossible eye and did not raise his sword. He could not have, even had he wished to. For a long time long enough for the ash to collect on lashes and melt, for the wind to pull it away again, the dragon simply watched. Jon braced himself for killing fire and found none. The dragon inhaled a long, smoking breath and poured it into the iron throne, and the throne shrieked and ran and became a river of red that cooled to black. The smell of it was old and full of sorrow. Then Drogon gathered the smallness that had been a queen, lifted her with impossible care, and left through the ragged gap that had been a wall. Jon watched him go until the sky ate him. He thought he would fall then. He did not. He turned in the sudden silence. Tyrion stood in the doorway with his face wet and grim, and behind him Grey Worm's soldiers spread like ink. Jon laid the knife down. "I will answer for it," he said, voice raw. "I will answer to all." Grey Worm's eyes were bottomless. "You will answer to me," he said, and his men seized Jon's arms, and the last of the ash fell like a curtain. They did not kill him. Tyrion suspected they would not. With the queen gone, the value of vengeance had changed its arithmetic. They brought him to a cell that smelled of wet stone and old wine and locked him like a valuable, dangerous thing. In the dark, the name Aegon beat at his skull like a moth at glass. He feared the moment when the moth would tire and fall silent. Footsteps came and went above him. The city moved through its first day without a monarch in a generation. Tyrion came once, a ghost in the doorway. "The lords are coming," he said. "The world will weigh you, Jon. They will drop you from a height and see whether you break like dead wood or bend like green." He tried a smile and failed. "I would tell them that you are stubborn oak, but I think you are something else entirely. I think you are winter wheat. I think you will be cut down and rise again." "Don't make me a verse," Jon said. "Not now. I don't write the songs," Tyrion said. "I only try to live after them." He looked a long time at Jon. "Grey Worm wants you dead. The Dothraki want to ride and ride until they find new cities. The small folk want bread. The lords want their old power back or a new power if it is offered on a clean plate. What do you want?" Jon looked to the floor, where moisture pooled in a shallow depression. He could see his face there, as if a fish ghost had come close. "To do right," he said finally. "That's all I've ever wanted." "Very few want that," Tyrion said softly. "It is terribly inconvenient." He left without saying goodbye. After 3 sleeps, if they were nights. In the cell it was always the same. Men came to bring him out. Grey Worm's mouth was a strict line. The air above stung his eyes. They led him to the dragon pit because the sept was long gone and the throne a puddle. The hill was damp and rough where the grass had been scorched. Lords and ladies gathered like migrating birds, with murmurs, with bright small glances, with cloaks thrown to catch sun and ash. The great houses of a smaller world, some of them haunted by new names. Yara Greyjoy stood like a spear. Gendry Baratheon wore a lord's ring. He kept flexing his hand against as if it might cut. Edmure Tully looked surprised to be alive. A princely man of Dorne watched from a shade, quiet as a scorpion. Ser Davos Seaworth stood not with the great lords but not far from them, exactly where a good man belonged. The boy who had been Lord of the Vale stood taller now, his eyes nervous and eager. Sansa stood with the proud tilt of the north. Arya beside her was all angles, like a bird that could fly at a thought. Bran's chair sat under a canopy. He was a fixed point to which gazes returned when they needed a place to rest. Tyrion walked to the center with less trace of swagger than he had once owned. "We cannot wage another war," he said to them all. "Half our cities are ash. We have no grain. The Ironborn want to leave, we should let them, and the Dothraki want to turn the Reach to a plain. We should not indulge them." He gestured at Jon. "We have a man who killed the queen. If you make him only a knife, he will be only a knife. If you make him something else..." Grey Worm's voice cut across like a blade on stone. "He killed his queen. He must die." Sansa's voice, cool and sure. "He killed a tyrant." Murmurs moved like wind in barley. "You all heard her promise to burn the world. The North will not kneel to a fire that turned its face south." The Prince of Dorne spoke with a dry, low tone. "We have been burned by dragons before. We do not prefer the experience." His eyes flicked to Jon and away. "But we also do not prefer an unnecessary corpse." Yara rolled her neck as if loosening a kink. "My queen swore to Daenerys. The dragon queen died in the city she burned. There is justice in that. There is also the sea. I'll have my islands and my ships." Edmure cleared his throat, hopeful, taking a step. "If it's about ruling, No," Sansa said gently, and Edmure stepped back, red. All of it moved around Jon like a storm cloud. He lifted his head. "I'll take judgment," he said. Voices quieted. Lords and ladies, soldiers, the wind. It was not loud, that quiet. It was the silence that fish feel as the net pulls tight. "I killed her," Jon said. He let the words be clean. "I loved her, and I killed her because if I did not, she would kill more of you. I will pay for that. But before I pay, I have to say this. There must be an end. If you put any man on a throne and let him be a king above law, he will think himself higher than men, as a dragon thinks itself higher than cattle. I am not higher than any of you. I am a man who knows a little about winter and fighting and promises. If you want me dead, then do it. If you want me to make what I can of what she left, I will do that too. But not as a god, as a man who will answer when he fails." The wind lifted a banner with the three-headed dragon of his blood, half-scorched, and let it fall. Tyrion looked for a long moment at Bran. Bran's gaze was far beyond the hill. When he returned from wherever he went, he looked at Jon with a gentleness that made Jon want to look away. "The realm was broken before the fire," Bran said. He did not raise his voice. Still, everyone heard. "It was breaking since the day Aegon landed. Fear holds many things together, but it rots them as it holds them. There is a better binding, but it is harder." He tilted his head. "We need a king who will be ruled." A murmured laugh ran through some, then died, tasting of relief and fear both. Grey Worm's mouth thinned. "A king under law is still a king. He killed his queen." Tyrion's hand opened and closed as if measuring a cupful of air. "Let the unsullied have the justice of leaving with their lives and their honors. Let them sail to whatever peace they can find." He looked to Grey Worm and bowed his head slightly. "We have no quarrel with you that needs more blood. Give us the right to make our own king. Help us end this without another pyre." Grey Worm's eyes moved from face to face. Jon watched the man's grief like a sea held too long by a dam. At last the commander nodded once, like an executioner permitting a last word. "Choose your king," he said. "Then give me the murderer and we are even." "No," Arya said, knife in her voice. Sansa's hand brushed her wrist, a feather of restraint. Tyrion's eyes flicked from sister to Grey Worm. "Justice can be more than death," Jon said into the tautness. He took the weight of their eyes and the iron in them. "Let me be king." A stir ran through the circle like winter over water. "But let me be accountable. I will stand for trial by the realm each year. I will swear to a charter that binds me. And when I break it, you will cut me down. If I ever ask a dragon to burn a city, you will cut me down. If I take a man's lands without cause, cut me down. If I silence a tongue because it troubles me, cut it out with mine. If I fail you, you will not need a rebellion. You will have a law. I ask you to make that law. I ask you to bind the crown with it." Silence. It lasted long enough for an ash flake to travel the breadth of the dragon pit and land on the rim of Bran's chair. Then Davos coughed gently. "A charter," he said, his voice like an oar dipping. "A promise on paper and parchment, with seals and signatures. I like promises that have to be read. They keep men honest, or at least they keep their lies tidy." The Prince of Dorne smiled a dry, bitter almond. "We will sign if we agree on its words. And may the seven judge me. I agree with the fishing knight." Yara snorted and rolled her shoulder again. "Break the world and then bind it up with threads," she said. "Fine. The Ironborn will not bow to your crown, but we can knot our threads to yours. We will be free islands or no islands at all." Sansa's chin lifted. "The North will be free. We remember. Winterfell will not kneel." Jon met her gaze and let warmth show. "Then the North will be free. But if you call, we will come. If we need you," she said seriously. "If you need us, we will listen." Tyrion swept ash off his sleeve as if clearing a chessboard. "Well," he said, "no throne, no sept, no king who thinks himself a dragon. A charter, a league of realms instead of one kingdom bound by habit and fear. A new name, perhaps." He looked to Jon with a small, crooked solemnity. "Aegon, if you will have it. I don't care what they call me," Jon said. "Only what I do." "We must care," Tyrion said softly. "Names make stories. Stories make men brave or foolish. We need yours to do the first." He turned to the lords, bowed not deeply but deeply enough. All those in favor of Aegon of House Targaryen, called Jon Snow, as Lord Protector of the realm and King under Charter, they said, not all at once. It moved like a slow tide, a reluctance becoming a decision. The Prince of Dorne nodded like a man conceding a game already played. Yara grunted assent with the nonchalance of someone choosing a wind. Edmure said, "I," too loudly, relieved to be included. The boy of the Vale glanced at Sansa and said it too. Sansa did not say yes. She said nothing, but she met Jon's eyes and inclined her head, queen to king. Arya's mouth didn't move. Grey Worm lifted his chin. "We have a king," he said. He looked at Jon as if across a very long road. "You promised justice." "I did," Jon said. He turned to the gathered, who were not yet his but would be. "Write the charter. Bind me with it. Bring me to judgment. We will begin there." They crowned him with a circlet that Gendry forged that night out of iron from the melted mess that had been the throne. The smith's hands were blistered with injury and pride. He presented it in a rag, and Jon held it without putting it on. "I've worn worse things," Gendry muttered with the sideways shyness of those who think themselves impostors. "At least this one won't cut your arse." Jon smiled without much amusement. "It might." He looked at the circle. A strip of hammered iron, plain, oiled against rust. He would wear it rarely. But when Davos placed it on his head the next morning in the half-ruined hall, with the dragon's weight gone from the city like an ache from a healed tooth, the small folk murmured the way men do at births. The Unsullied stayed long enough to see the charter drafted and to watch Jon stand for judgment the first time at the Dragon Pit. Tyrion read the charges like a list of ocean weather, that he had killed his queen, that he had conspired to set aside rightful rule, that he had betrayed the vow of love he had made with his lips. The High Septon, a thin man with a voice like a flensing knife and eyes that never lingered on anyone, recited the things that angered the gods and the way forgiveness could be stitched. Jon answered simply to each, and when the moment came, he knelt on rough stone in full sight of the people, the great and the very small. He waited for a sword or for a word. The word came. "Rise," the people said, not as a chorus but as many voices, scattered and clear. He rose. Grey Worm watched, and his mouth did something that was not quite a sneer and not quite an admission. Then he gathered his soldiers and the ships Jon had ordered repaired at his command and sailed for Noth, and he did not look back. And Jon stood on the quay and raised his hand and meant it when he wished them peace. The Dothraki rode east the next week, leaving a ribcage of hoofprints behind like the bones of a beast long dead. The rebuilding began, which was to say, the work of the living. Men with burned hands carried stones. Women with burned lungs carried water. Orphans named for crows and ash were gathered and fed. Because Tyrion had stood in the market on a broken crate and announced the grain levy and been nearly pelted with gratitude. Davos had sailed to Old Town, broken his voice on backrooms and allies, and returned with ships curtained in barley and oats. The Prince of Dorne sent figs as if to test the palate of a new king. The Vale sent iron and smithied nails in crates whose lids did not fit. The North sent cured meats that smelled like the breath of a remembered hunting morning, which made Jon breathe deeply and close his eyes. The charter took shape under the hands of men who distrusted each other. Words sparred, compromised, drew blood. Sansa's letters arrived to Tyrion with questions sharp enough to slice twine. The Prince of Dorne argued with a courtesy that had serrations. Yara swore creatively about seals and obligations. Davos answered in the same language with better grammar. Samwell Tarly arrived panting with his new maester's chain, tripping on a stone in the courtyard and rising with a grin. And when Jon embraced him, there were tears in both their eyes that neither pretended not to feel. Sam laid out parchments like bread on a board and cut them into loaves for everyone. What kings had done, what councils had chosen, what fools had promised and failed. They called it the Great Compact in time because men like to give names to laws that are heavier than the men who sign them. Some called it Aegon's Promise, which embarrassed Jon and pleased Tyrion. It bound the crown to a council of 9, 3 chosen from the small folk by odd, complicated procedures that Sam understood and no one else did, 3 chosen by the lords of the great regions, and 3 appointed by the king but removable by the other 6. The north, the Iron Islands, and Dorne were recognized as sovereign in all matters that did not bind the peace of the continent. Their queens and princes would sit in council by oath, not by fealty. The faith was given a chamber for council but forbidden an army. The citadel was tasked with rebuilding the city's cisterns and humbly forbidding their habit of forbidding useful things. The king was made judge of last resort and subject to public judgment yearly in the dragon pit, an absurdity that made the old men laugh until they saw the first judgment and then stopped. Jon held court beneath the green-stained ribs of what had once housed dragons and listened until he learned how to listen. A washerwoman accused a mason of stealing lime. A then, surviving his people's long dwindling, claimed a right to sell northern furs in the fish market without the guild's tithe. A child said she had seen a man push another into a well. He learned the patience of small injustice. So yes, the dull sand that grinds stone. He let himself be taught how to write, not in a soldier's hand that bled from a quill like an opened vein, but cleanly, so that when he signed laws his name did not look like a bruise. He read the letters Sansa sent with her precise hand and wrote back and thanked the old gods for her exactness. He took counsel of Bran, who sometimes would say only, "Not that way," and sometimes would say, "There will be rain, you should shore the west wall," and be right in a way that made men cross themselves and go about their business faster. At night, when the air cooled enough to smell the sea again, Jon walked the rebuilt ramparts with Ghost padding white and silent at his side. Ghost had come on a cart bearing turnips, red-eyed and weary as if he had walked every mile himself. The first time Jon saw him he knelt and put his face into the thick fur and lost words and time both. Now Ghost ranged and returned, the noblest of hunting shadows, and sometimes slept with his great head across Jon's boots while the king read. He did not wear the iron circlet when he walked. He let the night wind unfurl his hair, gray with ash at the tips that never quite washed out, and he thought about silence. There was so much silence in justice. It was not the music of victory songs but the long patience of mending. He refused to rebuild the Iron Throne. Gendry asked him once, in a low, uncertain voice, whether perhaps a throne of oak might suit. A throne like a table's captain chair, high enough to see from, heavy enough to mean something. Jon smiled, surprised at how the idea warmed him. "A chair is a thing a man rises from," he said. "Thrones are only things men forget how to rise from." He sat in a good chair of oak with carved arms that had once been balusters, and men learned to see it as a throne because men cannot help themselves. But when he stood up to greet a fishmonger or to walk the length of the hall to look out at the sea when the wind shifted and told rain, even small folk stopped noticing what he rose from. They noticed that he rose. Those first 2 years were all scaffolding and argument. Brienne of Tarth took white again, her oath remade before the melted place where a throne had been, and became Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. She cut her hair shorter and let the city love her the way cities love walls. Podrick Payne took the white cloak with the astonished look of someone given a miracle and not a punishment. Bronn of the Blackwater became Master of Coin because no one better could be found who had not died or run away, and to the irritation of everyone who expected him to misplace the treasury in a brothel, he ran the books like a tight ship, which made Davos smile. Tyrion wore the hand's pin with reluctance, took it off twice, put it back both times. Sam became Grand Maester after a controversy about vows and marriage that ended only when Jon stood in the dragon pit and said mild and dangerous things like, "We need men who can think about more than the past." The High Septon left muttering like a razor that had lost its edge. A gentler one replaced him, a man who remembered he was a shepherd and not a pharaoh. The first winter under Aegon was a lean one. The fields of the Crownlands had been salted with ash. The rivers carried silt and sick fish. Jon made mistakes. Price controls too harsh in a quarter where bread trucks were robbed and the robbers rose as heroes. An order forbidding the burning of rubbish that choked lanes with stinking piles. He gathered the city's guilds in a hall where the roof still bore claw scars and listened while a man with a flower-dusted tunic told him very politely that his law would starve them in 3 weeks. Jon repealed it within the hour. Stories were told thereafter about the king who could change his mind without losing it, and some of them were even true. He kept his promise to the free peoples who had come once through the wall, though the wall now lay in places like a broken tooth. He rode north as soon as the city could bear his absence and found Tormund giants baying in a country that had already begun to heal in the short way that lands do when men stop riding through them with fire. Summer grass came through the old burned snow like a blade. There were settlements with roofs made from planks salvaged from watch posts, and laughter when the days went long. Jon sat on a stump with Tormund, who drank sour beer and wiped his mouth on his hair, and they spoke of nothing and everything until the stars hung so full and low that they seemed like berries he could pluck from a hedge. "You always wanted to be in between," Tormund said finally, with affection like a slap. "Between a woman and a fire, between life and death, between a promise and a winter. You were made for being a bridge." "I am tired of being stepped on," Jon said, and Tormund roared laughter that sent ravens into the air like thrown ink. They made a pact, and it was not of parchment. Free folk could bring grain and timber south and sell it. Northern smiths would mend their tools without nailing them to maps. In times of hunger, each would remember the other's emptiness. The north did not kneel, but the north kept a path clear through its snow, and that was better. In the 3rd year of his reign, word came from the narrow sea that a black shadow had been seen crossing moonlit water. Fishermen spoke of something larger than a dozen ships that moved like a thought. Later, a shepherd on Driftmark swore that an eye like a furnace had watched his flock and judged it not worth the hunger. Jon went to Dragonstone with a small company. Tyrion, who said he had never stayed on an island that did not either imprison him or ask him to pay rent. Davos, because he trusted islands. Brienne, Ghost, who did not trust islands but trusted Jon. They climbed the old stone steps into air that smelled of salt, old smoke, and the memory of something that had called mountains home. Drogon had come back to the place where dragons had been named by black stone and heat. He lay on a ledge below the lip of the crater, one wing draped as if to warm a nest. Jon felt the old fear and the older wonder. The dragon lifted his head and looked, and his gaze tasted of other suns. He made no sound. He could have ended everything with a breath. He did not. He watched as Jon approached until a rumble moved through his body. Not a warning so much as a statement. "I am. I will not use you," Jon said, and the words were not entirely rational. They were a prayer or a treaty or a man talking to a river. "Not to burn men, not to make fear. I will not. If you must burn, burn me." The rumble stilled. Drogon lowered his great head and let it rest against the black glass of Dragonstone's heart. And in that gesture Jon felt the edge of something like mercy. He climbed to the lip of the crater and looked down and saw, cupped in a cradle of obsidian whose heat never truly faded, 3 eggs. They were the size of skulls. One was dark as void. One shone with an oily sheen like raven feathers. One had lines upon it that might have been the beginning of a crack or only stone's own story. He reached but did not touch. Tyrion hissed air. "If we were living in a story told to frighten dull children, this is the part where you make a mistake." "I've made worse," Jon said, smiling without humor. He drew back his hand. "We'll build a sanctuary. Keepers to watch. Scholars to learn. No raiders. No war. If they hatch, they will be left alone." "You think you can keep lords from coveting fire?" Davos asked, mild with iron underneath. "No," Jon said, "but perhaps we can teach their sons to look and know it is not for them. Perhaps not. But I will make it law, and when they break it, I will be there." They appointed a woman of Dragonstone named Miriel to lead the order that gathered around the crater, a fisher who had lost 2 sons in the fire and had eyes like wet stone. She wore a rope belt and a knife she did not present. She looked at Jon and said, "If any man comes to take them, I'll push him in before I push the eggs." "That's not the law," Tyrion said, and she looked at him until he stepped back. "That will do," Jon said. On the voyage back, he stood at the prow and let the spray catch his face, tasting the salt and old kelp and thinking of names. He had not asked anyone to call him Aegon the Just. Names were gifts or weapons, and you could not choose which. But when he reached the city again and the small folk cried that name as he passed, he let it be. He tried to deserve it. With peace came conspiracies, which is to say, the ambition that wakes when men think they can afford it. It was almost polite at first. Letters with too many compliments and offers of daughters with soft hands. Requests that sounded like favors and were debts in disguise. Jon could be patient with these. He could say no as if saying no was a kindness, which sometimes it was. The worst kind of intrigue wore rags. In the 4th year, the Ash Rats emerged. A gang of orphans scarred by the fires who turned their grief on those luckier than they had been. They robbed granaries and set fires in curfewed streets. When Brienne cornered them in a stable, 3 boys with knives faced her and asked to be cut down. She did not oblige them. Jon sat with them in a cell that smelled of straw and fear and listened to their stories and gave them work cleaning the city cisterns and roofs, which was a plague of stink and hard sun. Half left within a week. Half stayed and became a kind of order themselves, climbing rooftops like cats and sweeping ash from gutters and singing the obscene songs Kip the Cooper taught them. When Bronn asked if this was justice, Jon said, "I don't know. It's work. It's better than killing them." And Bronn said, "Not as satisfying," and then ruined the joke by looking thoughtful. The Iron Bank of Bravos sent a delegation with faces like the shutters of old houses. Tycho Nestoris was among them, his politeness a cloth so fine you could hardly see through it. They met in a room where the sea could be heard in the stones. Tycho spread accounts like maps. Jon looked at the numbers the way he'd once looked at storms and tried to understand if the ship could survive. He could have repudiated the debts with a king's insolence. He did not. He offered grain stocks, bonds on future customs at the port, and the opening of iron veins in the western hills abandoned during war. In return, he asked for rope, timber, and no interest for 3 years while the city remembered how to stand up. Tycho considered, blinked slowly like a lizard in sun, and finally said, "You seek to be poor and honest instead of rich and dead," and agreed. Tyrion whispered later, "You will be called Aegon the prudently poor," and Jon said, "Let them call me alive." The first true crack in the peace opened at Storm's End. The castle had passed to Gendry Baratheon by royal declaration that had seemed, even to him, a jest. He had taken the place like a blacksmith takes a hammer, warily, respectfully, and as if testing its balance. When men from the tattered remnant of the Golden Company arrived on a storm night, calling themselves merchants, they were offered shelter because Gendry was generous and Rosalind, the lady he had married, insisted that hospitality mattered even in rain. The mercenaries rose in the second watch, knifed 2 guards, and opened the postern gate. 100 men came in with wet steel and dry purpose. Gendry held the yard with a half-armed handful for long enough to bloody nose and pride both. He sent a raven that arrived in King's Landing bearing water on its feathers. Jon rode with Brienne and 200 horse along a coastal road that felt alive with lightning. He ordered no torches. The storms provided their own brief daylight. They reached Storm's End to find the outer gate taken and the bastion holding with 7 stubborn archers and a woman who would not go below. Jon sent Davos to the sea with 50, because in another life Davos had been a smuggler, and once you are a smuggler no door is fully shut to you. He took the main yard at dawn in a battle that felt like a brawl in a market. Brienne cut a man in a red cloak from shoulder to waist so cleanly the 2 halves held together for a breath before gravity remembered its duty. Jon turned away without being sick because there was no room for sickness in the yard. He found the captain of the Golden Company near the Great Steps, a hard-faced man called Ormalin who had a foreign lilt in his curses. Ormalin called Jon usurper and kinslayer. Jon parried, gave ground, felt the world narrow to breath and steel and footing. He disarmed the man with a feint to the hilt that had no right to work and struck him in the mouth with his pommel to make a point about words. They took the rest alive who would be taken. Davos came up by the sea gate with salt in his beard and 3 bruises blooming around his eye and said mild things about making friends with the tide. The aftermath was uglier than the fight, as aftermaths often are. Gendry, bleeding from 2 cuts and grinning like a boy who had won a race he had not known he was running, asked to hang the traitors from the high wall. Jon refused. He ordered a trial, to the irritation of every man whose blood was still hot in his face. The trial took 3 days because witnesses lie, especially to themselves. Jon's patience frayed like a rope under strain. In the end he sentenced a quarter to death, a quarter to the wall or what was left of it, and the rest to sales of service to the very men they had tried to replace. 10 years laboring for the houses whose heads they had sought to sever. "You're going soft," Bronn said, counting his coin and looking bored. "You're making bargains with corpses." "I'm making a world where not every wrong turns into a circle," Jon said, and Bronn stopped counting long enough to say, "You'll either make it or it'll eat you," in a tone so free of scorn that it sounded almost like respect. The faith was unrest by the dragon eggs. A sect began to preach that fire must be kept leashed beneath the city, that the gods themselves had sent flame to punish pride. Their leader, a stringy man named Septon Renifer, whose eyes looked always at a point just above the horizon where perhaps eternity stood, denounced the new abomination in sermons that drew people who wanted simple things like water and certainty. When a mob gathered on a summer evening with bad ideas and torches and walked toward the dragon pit singing, Jon rode alone into their path. Ghost came at his heel, all of winter in a single beast. Jon dismounted in front of them and held out his hands and said, "No farther." And the mob stopped because there is a way some men stand that is larger than their bodies. He listened to them, which is a dangerous thing to do to a mob because it can make it human. Renifer spat long words about dragons and judgment. Jon said that judgment would come to him if he failed them, that they did not need to burn anything to feel safe. The torches lowered. A woman with a baby at her breast spoke in a shy, furious voice about the price of barley. Jon listened and did not look at Renifer. By the end of an hour, the crowd had thinned to the stubborn and the hungry. Jon bought the rest of the torches with coin because sometimes a king can do that, and it is called policy. Renifer glared, then smiled slowly without humor and went away. The next week he was found preaching in the Riverlands, and Brienne sent word to leave him be. Some cancers do not spread when they're left alone. Letters came from Arya like winds off unknown seas. She did not describe much, but what she did paint came clean and sharp. A chain of islands where trees with blue flowers shed blossoms that tasted of salt. A shore where the sand sang when stepped on at dusk. A night sky strange with a fifth wandering star and the outline of a whale. She sent a drawing once, no artist she, of a boat with a square-headed prow and sails cut in a pattern that made Tyrion very interested. "We are only as wide as our maps," Arya wrote in a rare long letter. "Make this line longer for the children." Jon kept that letter in a drawer with a broken arrowhead from the far north and a lock of hair he could not name without sorrow. When he held it, the world seemed bigger and his crown smaller, which was a relief. In the 5th year, a plague came that the city called Ash Cough because it took the lungs first and filled them with dust. It began in Flea Bottom, where all bad things begin, and moved under doors like smoke. The Citadel argued about humors while people could not breathe. Jon rode into the quarter with a linen cloth soaked in vinegar tied over his face and had to talk himself out of panic at the sight of so many gasping mouths. He ordered walls erected not of stone but of rope and guards at the alley mouths. He ordered beer watered and boiled. He forbade gatherings and funerals and went to each house with a priest and a pot of broth. The city cursed him for 2 weeks and then the coughing stopped. He stood one night in the quiet and felt a joy so fierce and private that it frightened him. In the morning he went to the dragon pit for the 2nd year's judgment and heard a man accuse him of cruelty for forbidding mourning and said calmly, "You're right. It was cruel. It also saved your daughter." And the man sat down without a word like a ship whose wind fails. Old wounds do not stop aching simply because new skin grows over them. The North tested the edges of the compact. Yara demanded tariffs be lowered and raised her sails in a way that suggested she knew she could take what she wanted. The Prince of Dorne married an heir from a cadet line in the Reach and asked whether his son would be recognized as Lord Paramount of that fertile land. "No," Jon said, and then spent 3 long afternoons making sure the prince did not take that no as a reason to pick up his spears. He found himself tired in a way that did not resemble battlefield fatigue. It was the weariness of a shepherd who counts sheep with care and still finds one missing in the morning. He learned to sleep deliberately, like a man rolling a log to make a bed. He did not marry. It was not that he had forsworn it or lost the capacity to want. It was that the wanting in him had turned into something else. A thin, steady heat that he used to warm others and not himself. Sansa offered carefully phrased suggestions. Alliances with the Vale, perhaps, or with whatever Prince Dorne could spare. Not for herself, her letters made sure he knew, and Jon brushed them aside without resentment. Once he allowed himself to imagine a free folk wife with hair the color of dirty snow and hands like rope, laughing at the court and telling the lords their cloaks were foolish. He smiled into his cup at the image and did not pursue it. He had Ghost. He had a city full of crying children and hard-handed women and men who had learned to say "my liege" without irony. He had Tyrion, who told him truths like bombs or like blows and became his friend in a way neither had expected again in their lives. He had a brother who could see the flight of ravens as if from inside, and a sister who rode in winter and ruled like a knife wrapped in velvet, and another sister who sailed in summers he could not imagine. It was enough. The years drew him wider at the shoulders and laid fine silver in his hair. He cut his beard shorter and then shorter still and found that without the hair to hide it, his mouth looked more like his father's. He made mistakes in public. He apologized for them in public, and in a slow process more felt than seen, it became possible for men to admit error without losing their faces. In taverns, the old cynical slogans lost their shine. "Kings are wolves" became something only said by men who had not watched him hold court in rain and sun and answer a potter with the same attention he gave a lord. The name Aegon the Just began to be useful to those who came to him in fear. It began to be a warning to those who nodded their fingers behind their backs. On a spring afternoon that smelled of crushed mint and warm leather, he took a long ride alone to the ruins of the Dragon Gate. The stones had been lifted in part, the walls reset, but one arch remained shattered, and wildflowers bloomed where mortar had once bound. Ghost trotted ahead, then returned, his pink tongue lolling. Jon tethered his horse and sat on the low wall and let the sun work into his bones. He remembered another sun above another wall when he had been little and loved a brother who laughed at everything. He remembered a girl kneeling in the snow to brush the dirt off a grave. He remembered a boy's dead eyes opening for a heartbeat and seeing him and then closing. He thought of Daenerys and did not flinch. He had learned that the past does not strike you unless you let it, and sometimes even then it only rests its hand on your shoulder and asks a question you have already answered. Footsteps behind him were careful, Brienne's careful. She stood with her hands behind her back as if attending a lesson. "Your Grace," she said. "Jon," he said. She smiled the small smile of a woman whose mouth had learned austerity. "The council waits. They can wait a while longer. They like waiting. It makes them feel important." "They are important," she said, because for Brienne duty was never a jest, and Jon loved her for it. He looked out over the city. The roofs were new-dressed. Smoke rose not in sheets but in reversed commas, laundry and cook fires. The bell in the rebuilt September of Baelor rang, and it sounded like a bell, not like doom. Children ran in a pack with a rag ball, their shouts brighter than the cloth flags strung between windows. A hawker cried cherries. Somewhere men argued and meant it in a way that would not end in a blade. "Do you think it will last?" he asked, not of her but perhaps of the day, perhaps of himself. Brienne considered. "No," she said. He turned and saw her not smile. "I think it will fail in parts every day and be mended every day. I think that is how lasting is made." He nodded. Ghost put his muzzle on Jon's knee and sighed. Jon scratched the soft place behind the ear and felt the satisfaction of the beast move through his fingers into his mind. "Do you know," he said, "somewhere they will be saying I made this from nothing. Somewhere they will say a hero did it. But I know it was women with brooms and men with shovels and you with that sword of yours and Tyrion with his pin and Davos with his ships and Sam with his books. And those children with their ball. I want them to get the credit." "They will not," Brienne said simply. "Men like stories with crowns in them, but you will know." "Perhaps that will do," he said. He rose. The weight of the circlet was not on his head. The weight of the day was. He took it on his shoulders and did not feel crushed. He walked with Brienne down through a gate whose stones were warm to the touch, through a street whose name he could not recall but whose cobbles he knew under his boots. He passed a woman he had met in court when she came to argue with a butcher about the price of fat. and she nodded at him as if at a neighbor who had borrowed her kettle and returned it in good condition. He passed a hedge of new-planted roses with white centers blushing pink at the tips, and their smell was both cloying and clean. A child hit him in the ankle with the rag ball, froze and said, "Sorry, you're John." He kicked the ball back lightly and watched it arc, rag and string in joy, bright against the sky's hard blue. At the council table, Tyrion traced a finger along a ledger line and said without looking up, "You are late." Davos slid him a cup and added, "We started without you, as we should always do for efficiency." Sam lifted his head from a parchment to say, "I have a thought about guild charters that may bore you into an early grave but will also save you 3,000 stags." And Bronn opined, "Or we could get rid of guilds." Brienne stood and declined wine with her hand and ate a pear with the deliberate care of a person polishing armor. Jon sat, and the chair creaked, and he thought not of thrones or prophecies or songs. He thought of markets and walls and the taste of salt. He thought of the compact, which would fail in parts and be mended in parts, because that is what compacts do when they are used and not worshipped. He thought of the dragon on Dragonstone, who had not flown for a year and then had flown south and west and been seen below the horizon, a black line like an unwritten sentence. He thought of how the world, even when held together by law and love, frays at the edges because the edges are where it grows. "Tell me about the guild charters," he said to Sam. He said it without dread and with interest, the way a steward says, "Tell me about the harvest," because there is grace in knowing what feeds people. Sam began, and it was indeed boring, and Jon did not mind. In summer of the 6th year, a storm like a cracked amphora broke the sky, and lightning walked the hills like a god who had misplaced his sandals. A thin seam in the dam above the west cistern became a widening smile, then a scream. Jon rode through the rain to stand at the foot of that failing stone while the masons hammered in new bolts and the city murmured under its breath. In the rain, he was no king. He shouted, swore, carried 10-pound wedges like a man with neighbors to protect, his hair plastered to his skull. Water ran down his back inside his shirt and made him feel, for a ridiculous instant, like a boy caught in a summer prank. When finally the seam held, and the water beat itself tired and then went away, he leaned against the wall and let it take his weight. He felt something move inside him, a loosening, like a knot that had never been tied properly finally admitting it and letting go. That night, the city smelled of wet candle smoke and relief. In the window of a tavern 3 women sang a song, and when Jon listened he recognized it as the song that had first been made for his father, and then taken and twisted and then forgotten and now come back with new words. It was foolish and touching and wrong in half its details and right in something that had nothing to do with details. He listened until it ended and then stood outside a while, because sometimes it is necessary to stand outside songs. The 7th year's judgment was attended by a man who had killed his brother in a dispute over a corner of a field, by a woman whose daughter had been promised marriage and then abandoned for a better dowry, by a petition from an inn that wanted song taxes lowered, by a boy who had stolen a loaf and been beaten until his eye sealed shut. Jon judged, and he judged the judges in his mind, and he judged himself. After, he walked with Ghost along the wall until the stars had the airy look that comes toward dawn, and he thought of the boys he had been, the bastard with too much pride and too little horizon, the dead boy breathing, the man with a knife in his hand and a queen in his arms, and he did not hate any of them. He forgave the boy who wanted to be loved so badly he could be used. He forgave the man who could not see the end until it was on him. He forgave the king who would make a mistake tomorrow and try to mend it the day after. A rider came at dawn from the north, young, with a grim joy on his face and a flag of frost on his eyebrows. He brought news of the harvest in the winter town that was better than expected. He brought a letter from Sansa, written in a hand more relaxed than before, with a note about a girl named Barbary who had a talent for organizing granaries and a temper like a weasel, and could the king spare her a letter of authority. He brought a pouch of dirt. "From the gods would," he said, suddenly shy. "Our Lady thought you might like to smell it." Jon untied the pouch and cupped the dirt and brought it to his face. The smell struck him with a ferocity that felt like grief and was not. It was leaves and cold water and the skins of old apples, and beneath that something older, a kind of green iron, the smell of roots holding rock. It made him want to walk north until his lungs steamed. He tied the pouch shut with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Thank her," he said. "Thank her very much." The messenger lingered. "They call you Aegon the Just," he said, as if reporting a weather. "In the north we call you Jon, who knows when to shut up and when not to." He flushed. "Beg your pardon, your grace." Jon laughed aloud, delighted. "There's no better name," he said. "You may use it when you like." That afternoon the sea wind came from the east, and it brought the scent of rain on another country, and it made the banners stiffen like horses' ears. Jon stood at the parapet above the harbor and watched ships come and go, small purposeful insects on the skin of the water. There were boats from the Iron Islands with hulls like black bones. There were fat-bellied cogs from the arbor when the season turned, sagging with wine. There were little fishing boats with patched sails that looked braver than any fleet. A gull landed on the stone near his hand and cocked its head at him with a look like a magistrate's. He nodded solemnly. Drogon was seen again that year by a boy in the Mountains of the Moon who spoke of a shadow on the snow and the taste of copper in his mouth. The boy did not die of it. He told the story in a tavern, and it changed 3 times before it reached King's Landing. And in the last version the dragon had spoken in a scholar's voice and asked for a glass of wine. Jon listened, smiled, said it was good the boy had not been eaten. He thought of the eggs on Dragonstone, still eggs, which seemed both relief and terrible possibility. He thought of the Order of Keepers, who had built a low stone wall and a high understanding, and how Miriel would not let anyone past either. He thought of kings who had held dragons on chains and become chains themselves. He promised himself again, because promises must be remade, that he would not be that king. Years passed that were not empty and not full. That is how true years are. The city became something closer to a city and farther from a wound. The compact frayed when it needed to and held when it had to. Children born in the year of Ash grew into apprentices with calloused hands and uncomplicated laughs. Tyrion got drunk less often but more seriously, and one night told Jon about his first wife in words so simple they might have been wood. Jon listened and did not say he was sorry, and later he went to the Hound's grave and put a stone on it because he remembered what the man had been and not been. Davos grew even more like a piece of good wood polished by long handling. He took his leave one spring to learn the way Arya's sails cut water and returned with a map and eyes full of surprises he could not properly describe. Brienne wrote Jaime's last deeds into the White Book in words that made men weep when they allowed themselves the luxury. And then she closed the book and did not say his name again for a long time. Sam fathered a daughter with Gilly and named her Elia, and the city's tongues wagged with delight at what a man who wrote laws in beautiful hand named his child. And Jon kissed the girl's forehead and felt something settle in him like a bird taking a perch. Once, in an autumn as gold and thin-skinned as a good pear, Jon rode with a small escort to the Trident, to stand where the prince of his blood had once died. The river ran as it always had. He looked for ghosts and saw only fish. He knelt and put his fingers in the cold, brown water and thought of the music that had been made about that fight and about how poor a coin music is to pay for a father. He stood with water dripping from his hand and said, not aloud, that he forgave a man he had never known. He believed deeply that the dead cannot hear us. He said it anyway. He made more mistakes. He signed a grant that let a crony of a lord fence a piece of common ground and only realized it when a woman in a coarse gray dress stood in the dragon pit and told him, in a voice that had carried across markets all her life, exactly what he had done. He took off his circlet and held it in his lap and listened until she finished and then gave the land back and fined the lord and wrote to Sansa to ask if she had a woman like this in the north and whether he might borrow her. He judged in favor of a man who turned out to be a liar and then judged against him twice as hard. It did not undo the first wrong. He ate an apple at a festival and told a child that yes, he had once not known the name of a thing and had to learn it, and the child looked at him with awe, not because he was a king but because he had been allowed to be ignorant and then less so. He learned to dance badly at a wedding, and the bride laughed and then stopped when she saw who he was and then laughed again when he made the wrong step on purpose because it is important for kings to do that sometimes. He buried a soldier whose name he did not know, holding the end of the strap that lowered the plane box because no one else had come, because the soldier was one of 1,000, and because someone must lower the strap and then knot it up again so the next box can be lowered. He received a letter from the Prince of Dorne's young son, not yet lord of anything, asking for advice, and he wrote back with a drawing of a fishhook and a paragraph about the importance of listening to fishermen, which confused the boy and pleased the boy's tutors. He listened to Bran speak of a spring in the far north where the water ran warm all winter and moss grew that would make good beds, and he funded a settlement there and named it Mercy, which people mocked until they did not. He stood many times in the dragon pit for judgment. One year a woman accused him of favoring the rich because the law he had made to protect tenants failed to protect her, and she had lost her home when her landlord cleverly married her mother. He stood and took the words and changed the law that week, and the next year she came back and brought him a loaf of bread she had baked. He learned how to be humble without bowing. He learned that he could forgive himself without forgetting. He learned to stand where he must stand and to step aside when another must stand in his place. He learned that being just is not an attribute but a habit, like washing your hands or taking off your boots at the door. He learned until he was an old young man. On a morning when the wind was soft as the skin on a child's throat and the sun was the color of a glass of arbor gold held up properly to the light, Jon walked alone to the room where the melted throne had puddled. A clever mason had scraped the black iron into an oblong and set it like a scar in the floor. Jon stood with his boots on either side of it and looked down. He felt no triumph. He felt no sorrow. He felt only the quiet that comes when an old fever finally has drained. He bowed his head and spoke softly. "I did what I could," he said. "That was all." He turned away and found Ghost waiting as if by a door that only he could see. The wolf blinked his red eyes and huffed a breath that smelled of meat and long runs. Beyond the window the city moved in its day. The bells spoke, not in alarm but in invitation. Market opening, sun rising. Somewhere a child called to another, "Your turn." Somewhere a woman called to a man, "Come home." Somewhere a dragon flew across a far kingdom sky, or did not. It no longer mattered as much as it once had. Somewhere an island west of the maps saw a ship with a square-cut sail, and a girl stood at the prow and smiled at something no one else could see yet. Jon touched Ghost's neck and felt the steady, ancient certainty of a creature who wants meat and snow and the companionship of his pack. He smiled. He walked. The hall filled with the smells of bread and ink and the leather of new books. Tyrion would be waiting with numbers and old jokes. Davos would be waiting with a worry he would make small with a comment about ropes. Brienne would be waiting with the steadiness that lets men build. Sam would be waiting with a clause that would save a law. The world would be waiting with the next thing that needed mending. He would mend as much as he could before he slept, and if something broke again tomorrow, he would try again. He had once thought justice was a cliff from which men pronounced. Now he knew it was a road. He had been walking it a long time. They called him Aegon the Just. He answered to Jon. In the end, the names were two hands holding the same work. He did not dream of thrones. He dreamed of stones not falling and of people crossing bridges, and of bells that rang only for hours and weddings and pears laid in the sun to ripen on a windowsill. He dreamed of rain that came on time and roofs that did not leak. He dreamed of children running and not being stopped. He dreamed and woke and worked, and the realm, and this was the only coronation worth living for, learned to wake and work with him.